Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadri from School of Politics, and I'm your instructor for this course. I have already put in our module some material associated with this mini lectures I'm going to give you about the background for political science. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover in a very basic, 3-point scale, type of, outline, three major topics. One is going to be about the main concept we use in political science, the concept of power. Then the Roman numeral 2 is going to focus on the notion of people and power. And last but not least, the third one is going to be some concluding remarks. So having said that, let's start with the very first concept, and that's the concept of power. How do we define power? We define simply power as the ability of one to change the behavior of another. As you can see, this is a very, very general definition, because political science for decades and decades, they have debated and discussed, what should be in the, definition of power. But this basic definition is good enough to satisfy a lot of different political scientists who have very different opinions about it. You might say, okay, you gave me the definition, but what's the significance of power? Power is the most basic concept in political science, and we believe that in our literature, that power is like the fuel of the political system. Power is what gives the people the ability to make changes in the political system. Power is what allows the political elite to make decisions and to implement them. Therefore, power is extremely important, and it exists not just in political relations, but also in every ordinary relations. Now, sometimes people have a tendency to confuse power with some other concept. Perhaps the most important one in that regard is force. So let me say a few words about the difference between power and force. If you remember, I mentioned that power is the ability to change the behavior of, one by another. What we could also add is power has a tendency to be looked at as the ability to persuade. So when we are focusing on power, we are not, concentrating on instrument of violence. However, force is the ability to use instrument of violence to bring change. And that's where the two concepts are so different. You might want to think about it this way, that power is what many politicians and diplomats use to get the job done. But it's the job of generals and the soldiers to use force to, cause their rivals or foes or enemies to what? To do what they want. So in force, the whole notion of instrument of violence is extremely important and basic. Now, you might ask, okay, does power have any kind of characteristic? I would say yes. Power has actually four major characteristics, and these are very important. These characteristics are the fact that power is, first of all, relative. 2, power is situational. 3, power is dynamic. And last but certainly not least, power is multidimensional. Okay, what do we mean by power being relative? Well, when we say, someone or something is powerful, it doesn't mean it's not like a Shakespearean question. The question is, yes, it's powerful, it's not powerful. It's always a relative question, and it's a relative observation. So when you think about any powerful individual, you can always find somebody else who's more powerful than that. When you think about a powerful state, you can always think about another state or another country which is more powerful. And you can always find someone who is what? Less powerful. Like, for example, what do we think about, let's say Australia? Is that right? Wonderful country, wonderful people, good food, lots of fun, etc., etc. Is Australia powerful? Well, Australia is powerful within its own, range of countries that it fits. So Australia would be certainly more powerful in many ways than places like, let's say, Chad and Afghanistan and a number of other countries. There are a lot of countries around Australia, island nations that Australia is more powerful than them. Okay, but if you compare, for example, Australia to UK or US, you would see that, the power of Australia does not seem as significant as that of UK or US. So that's what we mean by power being relative. Next notion is power is situational. Okay, what do we mean by that? It means that in certain situation, a side that we do not consider to be so powerful could end up being more powerful. We have had stories about this in the Bible. Is that right? David versus Goliath. When you would look at the size of David as opposed to the size of Goliath, you say, of course, Goliath is more powerful. But here we go. David had a know-how that allowed him in the battle to what? Defeat Goliath. So that's why we say power can be what? Situational. We can see the same thing in modern politics as well. We don't have to go for, focusing on the ancient stories. For example, during the 444 days U.S. hostage crisis in Iran, there were basically a number of Iranian students who have violated international law and had jumped into the American embassy and have held, a number of American diplomats hostage. Well, this is against international law. This is against any kind of international rules, but we were not necessarily dealing with like Iranian government, which, had just came to power and very frankly didn't have as much influence over a lot of, elements anyway. So what happened was, during those days, we can say, even though, of course, the power of the United States is much more than the power of Iran, the Iranian students, they seemed like they have the upper hand. All right. We right now like to focus a little bit about the power being dynamic. Well, power levels of countries have changed throughout the history. A simple example. There was a time in 17th, 18th, 19th century, that even early 20th century, that people would say, the sun doesn't set in in the British, Empire, because they had so many colonies that, all around the world, that when this, there was a night in one part of the world, there was, day in another part, So that was, showing how powerful Great Britain is. Well, Great Britain still is a powerful state, but is not as powerful as before. We have seen this one not just with Great Britain, we have seen it throughout the history. Almost any of the empires, when you think about it, like for example, the Egyptian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. There was a time that they started very, very modestly from being very, very small and weak. And then throughout the history, they got stronger. And then, again, they went right little by little behind behind the screen, and, they lost their power. Last but not least is the power is multidimensional. Well, when we think about power, usually the first thing that comes to our mind is power basically means military power. Well, that is what we usually consider to be hard power. However, there are also soft power, and that is associated with the economic muscle of a country, okay? A country that is rich and has, for example, wonderful infrastructure, highly educated people, lots of industrial, productions, can feed its own people. These are all very, very powerful, tools in the hand of the, leaders of that country. So that's important. I would like to add also cultural power. There are countries that are, cultural setters in the international world. I think one of the things that's really ignored about the U.S. is the power that, Hollywood has. Hollywood sets basically the agenda, even though, not all Hollywood movies are basically representing the, 100% of, what the reality is all about. Of course, they produce also documentaries, but a lot of them is basically fiction or associated with the fiction or something. But the movies that U.S. is producing and the films and everything else around the world, they have tremendous amount of influence. So that adds to the soft power of the U.S. And there are also individuals who have who are very powerful because of their position and because of the respect for them. Like, for example, Pope, right? Pope doesn't have a military, to come and, conquer us and make all of us Catholic or something like that. Is that right? But Pope has a lot of respect. Doesn't matter who the Pope is. Some they have more respect than others. And because of that, he has tremendous amount of power and influence. All right. So these are basically the four major characteristics of power. Now I'd like to move to the next, Roman numeral, which is the relationship between people and what? Power. Well, the first question here when we are talking about that is, who has power? Well, it really depends on the system, but we can basically divide that question into two parts. We would say that in every society, the masses, is that right? The ordinary people have power. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we think, no, this is a dictatorship. People, they don't have any power. In reality, even in dictatorship, people have power. I will give you an example. And of course, the leaders of the country, they have power as well. Those are the elite, okay? So elite are those who have disproportionate amount of political power, and the masses are ordinary people. You say, well, I can understand that, Dr. Sadri, because it works like this in the US and many other democracies. What about in the dictatorship? Guess what? There were countries that they were dictatorship, and then because of the power of the masses, they changed system. We used the example of Iran, earlier for that hostage crisis. Well, here we go. Iran was a very good example, because it was in 1978, 79, the people, they rose against the leader of the time, the Shah of Iran. And, even though they weren't carrying any guns or anything else, they were able to what? Change the regime. You can see the same thing in Romania. President Ceausescu of Romania, who has been in power for so many years throughout the Cold Wars and everything, suddenly was overthrown by what? Ordinary people. Okay? So do not underestimate the power of people, even in places which are not democracies. Now, let's say a few concluding words right here. The first thing I would like you to remember for sure is, what is the most basic concept in political science? It starts with P, power. Do we have a definition for it? Yes. Are there many definitions for that? Yes. However, I really prefer if you remember that most basic definition, because most people cannot disagree with that. I also want you to remember the four major characteristics of power. I want you to remember that power is not the same as force, okay? And last but not least, I want you to remember what's the connection between power and what? And people. All right? Having said that, I hope that you enjoy reading, the material that I put for you in the module. And if you have any question, always feel free to contact me. Thank you.